Hello people, I wanted to check in on a game that was once the darling of the ARPG genre, a title that held so much promise and potential. This was the game that attracted over 258,000 players at its peak, so I dove deep. I interviewed and surveyed many players to uncover the current state of the game. Last Epoch was hailed the Diablo killer, which it never aimed to be, nor was there need for it. Little did we expect that Blizzard will be the Diablo killer. Last Epoch was made as a passion project by fans. It set out to do things a bit differently, and it was rewarded with the highest player peak out of all RPGs. After the peak goes the decline. It's why it's called a peak. And all of that leads to people asking almost daily, is the game dead? And is it worth getting? To answer this, I had to try and understand why were people asking this in the first place. I'd say it's somewhat easy to deduce this. It's the lack of coverage or media presence. Yes, content creators that were covering the game stopped doing so when the player count fell off. Less active players means less potential views, but it's not just that, it's also that there really wasn't anything new to talk about. The novelty of it all has vanished, and with it also the player base went from 250,000 down to just 5,000. Currently, the developers are working on the engine, and a big update is coming in the first quarter of 2025. The game runs on Unity, and to be able to deliver content in a regular cadence, the engine needs a touch-up. This is the main reason of why there is a dry spell of new content. The downside of this is that it seems like there is no development being done on the game and that Last Epoch has fell out of the race. Not just dropped to the last place, but completely fell out. You need regular cadence to stay in the race with big names like Diablo and Path of Exile. To stay at least relevant or mention-worthy. To make content creators talk about a game, you need to give them something to talk about. The player numbers you can check on Steam DB are low, or are they? I've asked people, do they check the player numbers and how does that affect them? Is there a sense of community? Do they chat with other people? Do they play the game in co-op? And I was surprised with the answers I've got. In general, players do not care about the number of players. Some of them do check the player numbers only to try and gauge the future of the game, but admittedly, it's just a vague estimation at best. Most of them play the game solo and don't really care about the number of concurrent players. One person said, I view ARPG games as a large puzzle. It's fun when there is a large community of players all working together to try and solve that puzzle together. So the sense of community comes from the collaboration on how to solve a problem or, as that person said, the puzzle, which is a fitting description. I never looked at it from that perspective, but I see it now. Builds, hard bosses, game mechanics, even story elements are something that people want to figure out. It's designed so it gives the player freedom to go and play other games, calling them back with new events, updates or seasons. Style that has been adopted as acceptable. Games do not have to be played all day, every day for all eternity. Other than that, the player number does affect the Circle of Fortune faction, the auction house, which makes sense since for a healthy economy you need participants, but on the other hand, the choice is there and players choosing the other faction, the Merchants Guild, are not participating. Merchants Guild players are even less dependent on a high number of players, which is just fine since that right there is one of the Last Epoch's strengths, the choice to leave everything and play offline. A lot of people don't have a stable connection. Even if you do, if you travel, you can play Last Epoch in the train or while camping. The choice is there and it has value. It has enough value that made people choose Last Epoch over other games. They said so themselves. The in-game chatting is toned down, noticeably so, but aside from just chatting, how can players interact? One player said that Circle of Fortune removes the player interaction while trading. He said that in Path of Exile you have to go to the other player and trade with them, and usually some chit-chat happens and you may just end up meeting new people that way. This is true, I haven't looked at it from that perspective. It reminds me of when I was playing WoW and wanted to find a group of people for a dungeon. I'd had to whisper lots of people and ask them. Lots of them ended up in my friends list. This meant that next time, if I'd want to do a dungeon, I'd ask them first. Then the party finder came and suddenly I had no reason to chat with other people. Yes, it's more efficient, but the price of it was human interaction. That human interaction is what makes the community. One thing that most agreed regarding the Circle of Fortune is that the UI is badly designed and needs more work. But when asked about the faction system as a whole, most players think it has potential. Circle of Fortune and Merchants Guild preference by the players is split down in the middle, which is a success in my opinion. Last Epoch can be played online and in co-op, right? So do people play it with others? Well, if they have people to play it with, they do. There are just few outliers that didn't want to interact with others and were happy to play solo and weren't interested in co-op. But one thing that everyone agreed upon is that the option to play co-op should always be there and that it helps build the community. Even though in Last Epoch's case there really aren't any motivators or mechanics to incentivize players to party up. For now. The benefit when talking about Last Epoch is that you can always end things with "for now", since it's at its infancy and has almost infinite potential. When asked about what things should be added to the game in order to increase player retention, everyone agrees that bug fixes were the top priority. Then new content, new bosses. Players were split on the idea of seasonal cosmetics and achievements. Some liked the idea, others abhor it. There was no middle ground. So I'd consider that a divisive subject that should be handled with care. This leads us to the topic of the campaign and the story. I've heard that ARPG players don't play those games for the story, that the campaign is a necessary evil. It made sense since at the end people want to make powerful builds and delete everything on the screen in an instant. Creating such builds requires time and grinding. There is no time for the story to get in the way of big damage. Or is there? While the players are divided on the importance of a good story, almost right down to the middle, all of them agree that all cutscenes must be skippable. I found this bit interesting since I haven't asked about skippable cutscenes. They had the need to make a point mentioning it. Most players think that the campaign is an important pacing mechanism, that it's something you need to do before reaching the end game. A sort of a gate or a ritual that needs to be completed so the end game has any meaning. There is a minority that would like to skip all of it, to just start building the character, and for those players, Last Epoch has a pretty good skipping system. Lots of players that were interested in the story wanted to see it continued, myself included. It should be noted that it's the story's job to introduce the setting, to explain why everything looks the way it looks. The levels, the bosses, the gear, the world. And if you want to create cosplays, merch, or rally behind a symbol or a war cry, gotta have the story. Warframe's story, however convoluted, does help players get around the game. So much so that they ended up creating a TennoCon, a dedicated community. Will see the game live and thrive for a long time. Last Epoch is said to be the middle ground between Path of Exile and Diablo, but the community think it's about 1/3 of the way closer to Diablo, which I would say just moves Path of Exile further away from Last Epoch than it does move Last Epoch closer to Diablo. Players' opinion is that this statement refers to the requirement of mental engagement and time requirement, which is good. You always want to design a game with a low entry bar but not make it too demanding, since it'll push people away. You'd be amazed how many people don't want the game to be a second job. Last Epoch has depth, a good crafting system, excellent skill specialization, meaning a skill tree for each ability, interesting archetypes, and a good character build process. A lot of builds are viable. There are many quality of life things, and there isn't a single thing that was put there to make you give them money. The easiest thing and the most scummy thing to do to a player is to limit the stash space. There is no actual reason to put a limit, but since the game developers know you'll need it, they'll put a fake limit in order to make you pay. But not Last Epoch. Here you can have unlimited number of stash tabs. And lastly, when asked, will Last Epoch be the next Wolzen? Everyone agreed that it might not be the next Path of Exile, but it certainly won't be the next Wolzen. Meaning players are certain that Last Epoch carved its own space in the ARPG genre, and it's here to stay. Everyone is glad that Last Epoch exists, me included, and it's a good game that can only get better. It's offering something others aren't. It's catering to a more mature audience. And when I say mature, you can look at it as older, more seasoned, or just mentally developed enough that they know what they want and what they don't want in their games. So to sum it up, Last Epoch is not dead, not even close. It's here to stay and get used to it. It's in a good state and will get better. The developers have their work cut out for them. They need to code, but they also need to talk about what they are doing, how it's going, and what are the plans for the future. Put something on your dev blog, especially now when Path of Exile is rearing its head. Thanks for watching. Hope this demystifies some questions about Last Epoch you had. I wasn't sure what I'd find when I started talking with people. I too had a bad feeling, but I'm glad this was proven to be unfounded. To everyone who I've talked to, thank you again. And to the absolute mass of people who spend time writing their opinions via the forum, I truly thank you.